Our webinar title is Effective and Engaging Lesson Planning, and we are happy to be joined by our speaker for today, Sara Carlo. Sara is a graduate of Michigan State University and Vanderbilt University, where she received her master's degree in community research and action and human development counseling. After 7 years of working as an elementary school counselor in Metro Nashville Public Schools, she began working full-time creating counseling resources and providing professional development. On a side note, Sara is married with 2 young sons and a puppy and lives in Nashville. I'm going to change presenters to Sara. Sara, you now have the floor. I will take my face, remove my face.
Thank you, Chloe. Hello, everybody. I am very excited to be joining you this evening to talk about effective and engaging core curriculum. This definitely became one of my passions over the past few years, and I'm happy that you chose to spend your busy time with us doing this together. All right, Chloe gave me a wonderful introduction, but I will add on a couple bits and pieces. I've lived in Tennessee for a little over 10 years now. When I first came down, I was actually in a different graduate program. So one of my master's degrees is in community research and action. That program was really focused on preventative and intervention programming on a wide variety of social issues. And through that program, I developed a really critical lens when looking at the different kinds of things that we do, particularly for youth, and in thinking about doing things that are research-based as opposed to doing things the way that they've always been done. Started, I was coming from being a clinical therapist and had not even ill-equipped and bad at them, to be honest. But over time, a lot of practice, a lot of research, I really love particular curriculum planning. It's something really exciting for me. All right, I wanted you to be able to put a face to the voice, so I'm going to go ahead and turn my little webcam off now. All right, why are we choosing to spend such a significant amount of time talking about core curriculum? Why do I think that it's important that we put so much emphasis on being thoughtful and intentional about our core curriculum services? Well, one reason is because of time. Our own time is, as you know, super duper limited. I don't know any counselor who has ever said, no biggie, if this isn't working well, I've got extra time to try again later. We've got to get it right the first go around. And our students' instructional time is also limited. Even when we have teachers that welcome us with open arms into their classrooms to do lessons, we know that our lessons are pulling from equally valuable academic instructional time, and so it needs to be awesome. I also think that our core curriculum needs to really make a difference and not just plant a seed. That's something that I'll talk about later. And finally, our students need all the social emotional learning that they can get. So that means not only should we really focus the bulk of our lessons on social emotional skills, but we should use every opportunity that we can within our lessons to foster this learning as well. There are 4 learning outcomes for this webinar. When we're done, you should be able to create a needs and data-informed school counseling core curriculum map, incorporate 5 core components of effective and engaging lesson plans into your instruction, and use 4 different cooperative learning structures to enhance your lessons. All right. This session focuses on effective and engaging core curriculum, and I believe that a strong curriculum map is really the base to that. Planning out our scope, the what we're going to teach, and our sequence, the order in which we should teach it. I think that when a lot of us started out as counselors, we weren't sure where to start with our core curriculum. It's actually really overwhelming when you think about the different things that we could teach our students about. My first year, I basically taught from a viewpoint of, this seems like an important thing to do a lesson on. Plus, when I Google about guidance lessons, this is what I find. And the result was RAGS, which if you've ever heard Lee Bagwell speak, you'll know means random acts of guidance services. It's not awesome. I didn't feel great about what I was doing. The teachers were more, yay, time to pee, versus, wow, this lesson is really valuable. And I didn't think that the kids were getting a ton out of it either. So I did what we all do, which is do some more Googling. And I saw that what a whole lot of counselors were doing was picking a topic each month and focusing all of the lessons across the school based off of that topic. Sometimes this looks like focusing on character traits. In September, we teach about trustworthiness. Sometimes it was just themes. So in January, we talk about career awareness. And sometimes there were skills, like April is for stress management. I gave this a try for 1 or 2 years, and the lessons went really well. It felt super easy to plan them each month because I was just making variations on the same idea. The kids were into it, and then I asked the teachers, both formally and informally, did your students apply what they learned about in my lessons? Did it stick? And they would answer with something like, we all love when you come for lessons. I said, great. Okay, do you feel like the kids really applied the ideas? And they'd say, your lessons are really great. And I'd say, thank you so much. But are the kids actually thinking or acting any differently as a result of my lessons? And then the truth would come out. And they would say, well, no, but we would love when you come, so please keep coming. This wasn't going to do. Clearly, I had to do something differently. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for counselors to deliver our core curriculum. It's an amazing way to build rapport with students for when we service some of them in group or individual counseling. We get to show our content knowledge to teachers, and we can plant seeds in our students' minds. The thing is, I believe our lessons should be more than that. I think our lessons should be more than planting seeds. They should actually result in change, not otherwise it's not worth all the time and energy. So my co-counselor that I had at the time, she and I came up with a new vision for core curriculum. Each year, we would have must-do lessons that students needed to receive no matter what. We needed to really rev up our data collection and do some formative assessment throughout the year so that we knew how things were going. And we decided to do grade level themes and units. The school-wide monthly themes were just not enough. Must-do lessons are lessons or skills that no matter what theme you might be focusing on with a grade, the students absolutely have to hear. For me, these have always been school-wide, but you might have some must-dos that are just lower elementary or upper elementary or lower middle school or upper middle school. My school's must-do lessons have always included Kelso's Choices or some other sort of conflict resolution skills training, especially Talk It Out or iMessages. It was also a must-do that at some point in the year, every student was reminded of some of the things regarding personal safety and sexual abuse. And for the last few years, I worked at schools that had peace corners in each classroom to promote self-regulation. And so a must-do lesson each year in every room was about classroom coping skills and introducing the peace corner supplies and the proper use of them. As I mentioned before, the monthly themed way of doing curriculum mapping just wasn't cutting it. Maybe if those monthly themes were being reinforced by everyone in the building, they would have had an impact. But realistically, that just isn't usually a possibility. We all know that our teachers are under just as much stress and just as many demands as we are. It's really just us and our 30 to 45-minute lessons. We would never expect a student to master a reading skill like blending in just one lesson. We wouldn't expect students to learn probability in one lesson. So we really can't expect our students to really learn a social emotional idea or skill in just one lesson either. We can plant seeds, but to have real growth, we need a higher dosage of our lessons. This is where themes come in. Repetition is our friend. And it's very easy as us as adults to want things to be very new and different and novel for us to see them as exciting, but children are a little bit different. They need the repetition and the consistency in order to really connect with things. So when we're talking about grade level themes, I want to first make mention of CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. If you're not familiar with them, they are the guru organization for researching and sharing best practices in social emotional learning in schools. And a few years ago, they released a report of programs, social emotional learning programs that were evidence-based. On that list, at least 7 of the programs that they deemed exemplary used themed units like this, meaning that they had several lessons covering each main topic or theme. So this wild idea of themed units is not just something I dreamed up. The research supports it as well. Here is an example of a curriculum map, similar to what my co-counselor and I used in the past. We planned for 20 lessons and 4 units, one each quarter, though of course we only ended up being able to do 17. You can see here some of the themes plugged into each grade level. That's what we did when we first started. Oh, I'm so sorry. You can also do just one theme for the whole year for each grade level. When we first started with this vision, we had much higher caseloads, and we were only able to do 10 classroom lessons in each class a year. So each grade level had just one theme, and nearly all of their lessons, with the exception of the must-dos, were focused around that theme. The key thing we found is that covering a topic multiple times in different ways or focusing on different specific skills, this was really effective in making our lessons stick. Now, something about this model of curriculum mapping, especially if you're only doing one theme for the whole year in each grade, it means that you're not going to hit every Tennessee state standard or each ASCA mindset and behavior in every grade every year. It was something that was really tough for me at first because I had this idea that those lists were meant as checklists, things to make sure that I cover. But I had to let go of that. I had to decide that I valued depth over breadth in order to make a more meaningful difference with my students. And once I began curriculum planning in this way, I never looked back because this is where I saw real growth. These themes come from, and I promise you it is not just from my imagination and what sounds like fun. First and foremost is they come from needs assessments. My needs assessment that I give out about a month and a half into the year, another needs assessment that happens mid-year, and then also in the end of the year evaluation, that's a great place for you to sneak in some needs assessment type questions that give you really helpful information about that cohort as you're looking ahead for the next year. Trends and teacher referrals are another wonderful way to get some ideas for themes for things, and also trends and self-referrals. For example, if your teachers are constantly referring students for small groups, claiming that their students are underachievers or that they need study skills in a particular grade, that might be a clue that that is something that that entire grade needs to focus on in core curriculum. If you're noticing that a specific grade level is constantly referring to you for individual counseling for friendship issues, that's a good clue that that's something that you might need to tackle in core curriculum. Some questions that you can ask yourself as well when you're thinking through what themes might be a fit for your grade levels. You know, my kindergarten team always asks me for, my first graders tend to struggle, my third graders always self-refer for, or I get a lot of fourth grade parent emails about. Those are the kinds of things that you can ask yourself when you first start doing your curriculum map if you're choosing to use a themed model. I also think that once you have some experience at a particular school, you really get to know the needs of the developmental levels of the students, the needs of each group of teachers, and a lot of the times you know what each grade level developmentally is likely going to need to focus on each year. Right. Moving on to data collection. Of course, attendance and achievement in behavior data is wonderful and amazing, and you can definitely use that if you think that your lessons are making a big impact there. But I think for most of us, we'll see a more direct impact in specific social emotional skills. So I want to share with you some ways that you can collect some data around that. There are a lot of informal ways to gauge the impact and effectiveness of your core curriculum. One is through counseling referrals, both teacher referrals and student self-referrals. If you do some lessons on friendship boundaries and then all of a sudden you're not getting a million referrals for friendship drama, then you've been successful. Anecdotal reports can be pretty informative as well, especially from teachers. Your own observations of students in the halls, at recess, in the cafeteria, that can give you a good idea sometimes of whether they're applying what you've taught them. And finally, exit tickets are a great informal way of getting student data regarding your lessons. Here's an example of an exit ticket that I used after teaching students about tone of voice. Here's one that I used after teaching students about their class's cool down boxes, where I asked them to make a plan for how they would apply the lesson and how they would use it. And a super simple exit ticket after teaching students about the Think Before You Speak acronym, where I asked them to identify which think rule was hardest for them. Exit tickets aren't going to tell you about the long-term impact of a lesson, but they can give you a quick idea of how well the students understood what it was that they learned about that day. I hear a lot of counselors talking about using pre-post tests with their students, and I think that that can be really helpful if the goal of your lesson has to do with knowledge acquisition. If you want them to understand some definitions of things, for example, then I think a pre-post on that can be great. I would caution you to not overuse student self-report surveys when determining whether or not your core curriculum is having an impact on student attitudes, beliefs, and behavior, because there are unfortunately a lot of limitations to using self-report data, especially with students 5th grade and younger. So I would really encourage you to focus more on teacher perception data and as opposed to student data for younger students. I'm not going to read all of this through you, but I am just going to flip through a little, just a few of the things that I found when doing research about student self-report. Essentially, you might get some helpful information from it, and I think it can start not use student self-report of their own attitudes and behaviors when determining whether or not your core curriculum was effective. But formally, I think that teacher surveys are great, either paper and pencil or digital with Google Forms. You know your faculty teams best and whether or not they're going to respond to each. If you are doing just one theme for the year, I really recommend giving the same survey to your faculty bi-monthly to track progress over the year. That also is awesome because it can help you decide if there's some specific areas that your students are already doing great in and don't need covered, or some areas you need to review. For example, one year with 3rd grade, our theme was on conflict resolution. I ended up editing my curriculum map as the year went on because without having a lesson on it at all, most students were already giving quality apologies and showing forgiveness. But a lot were still using the word bully wrong, so I circled back to that instead. And when I first started using these, I was using a Likert scale of frequency and agreement regarding certain attitudes or behaviors, like you can see here. This was a 2nd grade teacher survey when our theme was on social skills and friendship skills. The problem with using this is that even though there's the line based off of the majority of the class, teachers still had a really tough time not thinking about those kiddos that really struggle socially and emotionally when they were responding. So then I thought more about it and realized that if we were thinking of our core curriculum as part of Tier 1 instruction for social, emotional, and behavioral support, then our goal is really to have 80% of more students, quote unquote, on benchmark, are mastering whatever skill we were teaching and saw as developmentally appropriate. So you can see in this example, switching over to that. Now, of course, we hope that 100% of our students are really grasping, applying our lessons, but realistically, success is 80 to 85% of our students. All right, moving on from our curriculum map, moving on from data and diving into lesson planning best practices, which started first with things that I noticed worked really well with my students. And after diving into the literature, I found that there was some great research to back up the practices that I was using as well. And I have 5 best practices that I am excited to share with you. Not only do I find that these practices make lessons engaging and effective, but I also strongly believe that the best classroom management comes from a well-planned lesson. And so when you are creating lesson plans that are using these practices and that are highly engaging to students, there's a much lower chance that you will have to handle behavioral issues during your lessons. Woohoo! The research says that active learning techniques are key. I think we all know that lecture isn't going to cut it. We also need to provide explicit instruction and promote generalization. Generalization is one of the most important things we're going for. Not only do we want them to understand the skills in our lessons, we want them to use them once we've left. And Castle also found that the strongest SEL programs included the SAFE acronym. They were sequenced in a meaningful way, they used active learning, they were focused on skill building, and they were explicit and specific in their goals. Not only do we want our lessons to be focused on social emotional learning for a bulk of the time, I think that's what our students need, but our lessons themselves really should also include teaching practices that foster social emotional skills. This gives students a little extra dose of SEL and also serves as a great model to any teacher that is still in the room. Some instructional practices that are amazing that we should include: cooperative learning. We're going to talk about some specific examples of that later. Classroom discussions, self-reflection and self-assessment, which is really easy to incorporate into exit tickets, and competence building, which is a really fancy way of saying that we should go through the following when we're teaching a specific skill. We should model it, have students practice it, and provide them feedback and coach them as they practice. One of the simplest examples that I have of this, of competence building, is when I'm teaching I statements. We sit in a circle and I model with a few students. Then they stand in the middle. I pull them up in partners. I read a conflict scenario. They practice giving and receiving I statements. Did well and coach them into really nailing it. Now, I am not a leader in the school or a huge Covey proponent. However, I do absolutely love the idea of beginning with the end in mind. As school counselors, I think that many of us were trained, or what was modeled for us was asking, what's the topic when we were planning a lesson? What are we talking about today? What's the topic? That's okay, but what is so much better is asking yourself, what's the objective? Maybe you've got healthy friendships on the mind. That's a topic, not an objective. Do you want students to be able to define what a healthy relationship is? Do you want them to identify examples and non-examples of healthy relationships? Do you want them to increase their healthy friendship behaviors? Those are objectives. You want to ask yourself, before you pick out a book, before you pick out a video clip, before you pick out an activity, how do I want the students to be different as a result of my lesson? Some examples of objectives that you might have for a lesson. Students will identify 3 things friends do and 3 things friends do not do. Students will demonstrate at least 1 coping skill. Students will identify 2 post-secondary pathways that match their interests and strengths. Students will express 1 example of when they feel mad, sad, and worried. All right. Second best practice, one that I'm quite passionate about, is to chunk it. You know that your students' time spans are short. Chunking the lesson into parts keeps them engaged and also allows you to deliver the lesson through different modalities, like a hook, which is when you're really grabbing their attention, activating prior knowledge, a direct teaching component, an element of applying or practicing the skill or knowledge, and reflection or assessment. I would say that any lesson that I do has at least 3 chunks to it, and that includes 30-minute kindergarten lessons. Looking back to our social emotional learning gurus, at least 3 of the programs that CASEL has identified as really strongly evidence-based explicitly chunk their lessons. A program called 4Rs really caught my attention because their lessons are based in bibliotherapy, which I believe many of us feel passionate about, but it's not read a book, do a worksheet. After reading the story, they do a book talk with discussion or writing, and then do a role play to apply the learning and practice the skills. When I talk about a hook, that can be something really simple like stand up, sit down. You know, stand up if anyone has ever talked about you behind your back. Sit down if you know what the word harassment means, all kinds of things. It's also awesome because it incorporates a little bit of movement and it gets their brains going on the topic. Video clips can also make great hooks. There's several amazing Sesame Street ones, especially Cookie's Crummy Pictures, which is a series entirely on executive functioning and self-regulation. Pixar's For the Birds is another little video clip that I think is really helpful for a hook. And simple visuals can also work, like Duck Rabbit if we're talking about perspective taking. And of course, stories are amazing hooks. For example, Trudy Ludwig's The Invisible Boy, or really any book by Trudy Ludwig, in my opinion. Stories can also be short things that you make up and have your students act out. For example, when I teach about best effort, what does it mean? What does it look like to give your best effort in class? I have students act out a low effort Lisa and a high effort Henry while I'm reading about some of the actions or behaviors that they're doing. There's a good chance that your lesson might also need to have a teach component. You might need to include some direct teaching of a skill or some information. You can do a PowerPoint for it. This is a slide from a lesson teaching students about their brain and what it means to flip a lid. Stories can also serve to teach students. For example, Maria Dismondi's Juice Box Bully provides a hook, but it also explicitly teaches what it means and looks like to be an upstander. And sometimes we just have to provide a limited amount of direct instructing and telling students what to do and or modeling of what we want them to learn, like with iMessages. This is something where you would directly, in a short amount of time, go through each of the why we use the statements and modeling it. The most important chunk to our lessons is the applying and practicing part. This is where we're going to get the information or skills to stick in their brains. I use a lot of task cards in my lessons, like this one on the right, using the right tone of voice in a situation. We'll talk later about some different ways that we can use task cards. Sorting cards is another way to practice things. This picture is from students sorting activities by whether or not it is using class time wisely. I've also done things like, does this make the conflict worse or better? Sorting helpful versus unhelpful thoughts, comfortable versus uncomfortable feelings, matching up goals with their action steps. There's a lot that you can do with it. And of course, role plays rock. This picture shows students practicing respecting personal space by asking for permission to enter it, to touch someone's hair or give a hug or high five, as well as practicing saying no and practice respecting hearing no. And sometimes a role play can also be as simple as asking students what they would do in a situation. When I talk to my big kids about conflict resolution and ignoring, we talk about how sometimes we need to use self-talk to help us ignore and move on. And so I gave them scenarios and they would pretend they're in this conflict scenario of someone being mean to them, and they would generate some of the self-talk that they would do. Sometimes you have to get a little bit creative in role plays, particularly because I believe, and the responsive classroom approach to things would echo that it's not best practice to have students model incorrect or inappropriate behavior. So when you have students do something like responding to someone being mean, you don't necessarily want to have a classmate acting that out, but there are some other ways that they can get themselves in that mindset and sort of role play how they would respond. And the final chunk to consider when you're chunking your lesson plans is reflection or assessment. This can be an exit ticket like we talked about before. Here's another example of one, this time where students learned about effort and then they took out a recent assignment that they had completed and scored themselves on it. Post surveys are another way to end. I had mentioned before that is really excellent if you want them to gain some new knowledge. So maybe it's or they really do need to understand the definition of different kinds of conflict. So if they're using the word bullying correctly, a post survey is going to give you great information about that. And short processing activities are another great way to end. This can be as simple as just sitting in a circle and giving a prompt like, we just talked about talking to a safe adult if you feel uncomfortable. Name the first safe adult that you'll go to if something happens. And then just a quick sequential circle, go around and they respond. Or if I do an activity with students where there's a lot of different discussion questions involved, this is an example from a processing activity that we did with a book called Trouble Talk. I'll take the few questions that I think are most relevant to that class and with a dry erase marker, put a little star on them. And then when we're done, students hand back in their cards unless they have a star. And then I ask those students to one at a time ask them. And those are things that we talk about whole group. All right. Lesson planning best practice number 3, the one that I get a lot of eye rolls about, is skip the worksheet. Okay, I know that this sounds a little wild because this is something that a lot of us were taught to do in grad school, but if you'll hear me out, I think that we can do a little bit better. When I first started working in Metro Nashville schools, we had an incredibly limited budget, a budget that was so limited that we were given a certain amount of paper at the beginning of the year. And if we ran out, that was it. There was no more paper for us to use. We also had one day a week where we were instructed to not use any paper at all that one day of a week for the entire year. So it started out for me a necessity. I had about 500 students on my caseload and I did not have enough paper to do worksheets with them. I found though at the end of the year that I did not miss using worksheets, and the creative activities that I came up with instead were far more meaningful. Another reason that I think it makes sense for us to skip the worksheet in core curriculum is because in any given classroom, you have many significantly different student levels. What do you do with early finishers? If you have your own classroom and you're in the rotation, you might be able to come up with some wonderful procedure to handle this. But if you're pushing into a classroom maybe once or twice a month, that's a lot trickier to manage. And in addition, you don't have time to meaningfully differentiate worksheets for all of your students and all of your grades. The real kicker though, is that worksheets are not well aligned to lesson objectives. We talked earlier about thinking through how we want our students to be different as a result of our lessons. They're not going to be able to be different or show that difference as a result of a worksheet. Rarely are they going to have anything change because they filled something out. Another piece of the pie for skipping worksheets is once they're done, what happens with them? I am a mom. I am a very engaged mom who super duper values education. And when my son brings home worksheets, I put them directly into the recycling bin, which means I know a lot of other parents are doing the same. And also, when we're using worksheets to fill time in our core curriculum lessons, we're really missing out on the opportunity for deeper learning and growth. Now, some caveats, because there are a few times that I think that maybe worksheets can be beneficial in a guidance lesson. Some people tell me that exit tickets are just really small versions of worksheets. I do think that exit tickets can be really powerful, especially when it's your first go around with a lesson and you need to really check in and make sure it's making sense to students. I think sometimes the process of completing something can be really valuable in itself. For example, practicing with I statements. Sometimes the process of filling those out can be really helpful, can help cement it in the mind. Sometimes goal setting is another time that I think it can be really helpful and valuable to take the time. Or if you have a plan for the final product. For example, in 4th grade, I talked to my students about what reputation they wanted to have for the year. They selected one and then they made a plan for what they needed to do during the year in order to earn that reputation. All of the students had those blue Nikki folders that had the clear little pocket in front. And so there was a plan for their little reputation plans that they would put in there, and it was something that they could see all of the time. 4th best practice in lesson planning is get your students working together. It's just good and an opportunity for students to practice their communication skills, which is extra important as I think many of us have increasing numbers of English language learners in our classrooms. Of course, it's giving them the opportunity to practice more conflict resolution skills. And it also allows for you giving more challenging tasks. For example, you can include more activities that involve reading when you've got kiddos grouped together. Now, I'll be honest, having students work together in pairs or groups, especially if you don't let them pick, and I never let them pick, does mean a lot of extra work for you during the lesson. They're going to complain about who they're with. They're going to squabble, and there might sometimes even be tears, but it's worth it because all of this allows you to do great work coaching them through these sticky situations in the moment when they need it most. Also, as humans, I think we are just built to connect, and we do our best learning in the context of togetherness. 5th and final best practice with our lesson planning is to incorporate movement. Our students have a lot of physical dysregulation issues, and our school days involve way too much sitting and not enough recess. Movement in our lessons can be as simple as starting your lesson on the rug, then moving to desks, then coming back and sitting in a circle. Bonus points if you have them do fun things like walk like penguins or scamper like mice when they're moving. 4 corners is also a great way to use movement and is a wonderful hook as well when you do opinion-based prompts. So for example, you might ask students, which trait is most important to you in a friendship? And then walk to 4 different corners of the room and give each a trait, such as having fun and laughing together, having things in common, spending time together outside of school, and so on. And then ask students to walk to which corner they most align themselves to. We talked earlier about sorting cards. That's less gross motor and more fine motor, but it is tactile and it still allows for students to move their bodies, stretch out on the floor, be comfortable with themselves. Same with matching cards. And then there is a really quite popular activity called Scoot. If you're not familiar with it, it's where there is a question or a prompt on each student's desk. And each student also has a recording sheet. They essentially travel around the room responding to each of the prompts on their recording sheet. Everybody moves simultaneously, usually given the prompt scoot. They move over to the desk next to them, read the question, answer to it. Wait until they hear scoot, move to the next desk, and so on. I think this activity is really fun, loads of movement. I do recommend it done this way, only if your students are very proficient readers, because otherwise it can be a bit frustrating for students who are still developing readers or who the timed aspect of things can be a little bit frustrating. Another option, though, is something that I call scatter, although I'm sure it might have a fancier name to it. I make 2 copies of all of the questions or prompts that I want to ask. For example, in this picture, all of the prompts were conflict scenarios, and the question was simply, what can you do? And then I projected some of the different conflict resolution strategies that we'd learned about together. I took all of the copies of the questions, numbered them, and laid them out on a rug. Students worked with partners, and they would go to the rug, pull a card, take it back to where they were working, read it, answer it. take the card back to the rug, grab a new one, and so on. Working with a partner and having it be self-paced made it a much better fit, but it still included lots of movement. Headbands is loads of fun. Some of us probably have played it just for fun with friends using the cell phone version, or maybe in small groups as a little bit of an icebreaker. You can also do some similar counseling related activities that are like headbands. So for example, you could clothespin feelings or character traits or careers onto students and have them walk around trying to figure out what they have on their back. And once they've guessed correctly, they move their word to their front, the front of their shirt, and then they help others to guess theirs. And last but not least, using hand motions rocks in lessons. This is something that I didn't feel my first couple of years, because you're sort of putting yourself on display when you're doing something like this, and not all of us are comfortable with that, especially if the teachers are watching. But after I tried it for the first time, I realized that it was a really, really wonderful strategy. I used it for the first time when teaching students about how to ignore when they are being annoyed or bothered, because I would hear teachers all of the time tell their students, oh, just ignore it. The problem being, my students didn't actually know what that meant or looked like. So I came up with just a super simple call and response chant and motions, which I'm going to bring to your attention my own son, who helped model this one for me. Fingers crossed that this video will work for y'all.
Sarah, we just don't hear the audio.
Oh no, okay. So I'll just tell you what he was saying. Chloe let me know that you guys couldn't hear the audio. So it's just going through ignoring means I ignore with my eyes, I ignore with my eyes. Ignoring means I ignore with my body, I ignore with my body. I keep doing what I was doing. On my website is the full like script and the motions for it. So if it's something that you're like, yeah, no, I definitely need to do that, please email me afterwards and I can send you the link for that if it's something that you're interested in. But as you can see, my probably at the time 4.5-year-old son was able to pick this up incredibly quickly. I've also used it as old as 3rd grade, and they got incredibly into it because they were able to put a little bit of a rhythm to it and add some of their own little flair. All right. The last section that I want to share with you about effective and engaging core curriculum are some activities that I think are so fun for you and for students, and that you can apply to nearly any topic that you might want to cover in your classes. These are all considered forms of collaborative learning. So collaborative learning is whenever students essentially kind of have a shared goal of something that they are working on together, and they cannot achieve this, they cannot do the activity without working together. This positive interdependence, I think, also functions to help create a really positive class culture. The first is called Fan and Pick, although I call it Pick a Card when I'm working with my students. Fan and Pick was the original name, which came from Robert Kagan. Fan and Pick is an activity that students do in small groups, ideally groups of 4, but you can do it in 3s if you need to. It really feels like a game to students, so there's a lot of investment from them. And the best part is that turn taking and sharing is structured. Sometimes you have a class and the thought of having them work in small groups is a bit painful because you just know it's going to be a wreck. Fan and Pick is amazing because there is no arguing over whose turn it is, who's holding the materials. All of that is structured. Now, if you were here with me, I would put some of you in groups of 4 and we would practice it together, but we're not. So I'm going to walk you through some of the different steps. Don't feel the need to take a picture of this or anything, because at the end I'm going to share with you a link where I have all of these directions written out for you and even more detail. So Fan and Pick uses question cards. And when I say question cards, I mean they can be discussion questions. It can be a picture and a prompt. It can be a multiple choice question, or it can be a specific task. You can even do it with big kids, not just the littles. Students work in groups of 4 and they sit in a square with a job board placed between them. And whichever job is in front of them is their role during that round. Person A will fan out the cards and say, pick a card, any card. Person B selects one and reads it aloud to person C, who then answers. Person D responds to person C's answer with an I agree because, or I disagree because, or they can add on to person C's answer. If you have a really quiet group, you can coach them to say thank you for sharing or thank you for answering if that's the most used question in a discard pile. The jobs board gets rotated so that everyone has a new job, which means the cards get handed to the next person over, and you continue on either until all questions have been answered or time is up. One of the wonderful things about this activity is that you can do it with as short amount of time or as much time as you have. And again, it's self-paced, so there's no worries about some groups getting through more questions or not getting through enough of them. Typically at the end of this activity, I gather the students around in a circle and I ask if there are any specific cards that they want to talk about whole group, or I may have possibly earmarked some that are really kind of relevant issues for that group. Carousel is another wonderful activity that you can use in a lot of different ways. Problems or questions are posted around the room and students travel around and respond to each of them. This is a quote from a book that I read with the students. The quote was, Jack said, a guy's got to do what a guy's got to do to be cool, right? Agree or disagree? And the students would travel to this question as well as several others around the room and write their answers. You can either have students travel as groups and give a signal like a chime for them to rotate, or if they're mature enough, they can do it a little bit more free range with you giving them the guidance that they have to respond to every question, for example. I wasn't sure if this would work with the younger students until my co-counselor gave it a try. So in one of her first grade lessons, she posed conflict scenarios around the room and the students traveled in small groups and gave their strategies for what they could do if that happened to them. This is another example. This was from teaching students about responsibility and pretty much what the stakeholders' roles were and these different quote unquote jobs getting done. A bonus to Carousel that I recommend for 3rd grade and older is having the students interact with one another's ideas. They can do this with question marks, underlining, stars, asking questions, making connections, all good things. Next up is something called quiz trade, or sometimes when I'm doing it with some of my more developing reader classes, read trade. It also uses question cards most of the time, like some of the ones discussed earlier. There's lots and lots of movement in quiz trade, which can be a bit overwhelming, but is sometimes very needed. The thing about quiz trade that I think is so wonderful is you can cover many scenarios for a given skill, or many different questions, which I use that when I'm reading a book that I think is particularly meaty and that there's just so much that we can talk about with it, far too much to be able to do in a whole group discussion. So for example, the book Trouble Talk by Trudy Ludwig is one of those meaty books. So we did quiz trade with that so students could think about a lot of different ideas for it. Once in a younger grade classroom, we wanted the students to practice being more inclusive of one another. So the students helped us generate some different statements that they could make to include others or to ask to be included. And then they followed the quiz trade model, which I'll get to, in order to practice these over and over again. Because they had created this with us and we projected it and went through it a few times, we were able to do it with a class that were not yet super independent readers. The most important thing with quiz trade is to model all of the elements along the way. Model for them your expectations for how they find a partner. We like hand up, pair up. Model the voice volume to use, model taking turns. They'll give each student a card and then prompt them to stand up and find a partner. Partners take turns reading their cards to one another and answering each other's questions. They then trade cards and turn around and find new partners. Like fan and pick, you can do this for as long as you want. 10 to 15 minutes is usually the length that I think works out best. And last but not least, mix, pair, share is wonderful as well. It's similar to quiz, quiz, trade, but there's a bit more structure involved, which makes it a better fit for some classes. And there's no student reading is necessary, and you can incorporate music. It can be something that is simply just a visual that you project and then give students a prompt to. For example, how is the boy feeling? What does the girl want? You know, what needs to happen next in this situation? It could be a what should you do? What should you say given a scenario? It could be a discussion. If you ask students to mix, which means walk or maybe even dance, around the room silently. You'll stop the music or call out for them to pair up. They pair with the closest person. Again, this is something to model, so they're not just running for their bestie. And they stand back to back with their partner. This is key because otherwise the moment that they're partnered up, they get a bit chit-chatty. You will read the question or read the scenario or project the prompt and then give the students some silent think time. Then say share, and the students face one another and share their ideas. You'll also want to remind them to turn back to back again once each partner has shared their idea. And then you repeat for as many rounds as you have questions for or have time for. If you are interested in having some templates that might help you in doing some of these things like the jobs board or some templates for making your own question cards, or you're looking for a new lesson plan template or a template for creating pre-post or bi-monthly teacher perception data surveys, I have a Google Drive folder that has those in there for you. So if you want to take note of that URL at the top there, it is case sensitive. Inside of that folder is a PowerPoint that has these templates. You'll want to download it. Don't try and use it in Google Slides. It will look like a mess. And there's also a PDF, and that PDF has really detailed directions about the 4 activities that I talked about, as well as some other activities that might be a lot of fun in the apply/practice section of your lessons. And with that, are there any questions?
Sarah, I am not seeing any questions on the question thread.
Okay.
This was phenomenally informative. I wish I was back in my elementary classroom so I could implement some of this stuff. It was just, you know, I feel like my brain is just buzzing with fresh information. It's absolutely awesome. Oh, we do have one question coming in. So the attendee asked, what suggestions do you have for a 30-minute lesson?
Yeah, 30 minutes is tough. I think it is especially tough with older students. One thing that I recommend and that I've done in the past is essentially splitting your lessons into 2 30-minute segments. And so maybe in the first session, you are reading a book and talking about it or doing a role play based off of it. And then in the next session, you're doing a more structured practice or applied activity with the skill that or attitude that you wanted them to learn from it. And then they're doing like a reflection and processing piece. Another thing that you can do if you are feeling like you've got so much to do in this 30 minutes and you don't have enough time is, if you're able to, make some copies of some things for the teachers to be able to use afterwards, such as in morning meetings. Sometimes I think, especially if teachers have put on a needs assessment that they're looking for something to be covered, they can be really likely to implement something and reinforce it if we take the time to make it super, super simple for them.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So we have a couple more questions coming in. So do you collect the exit tickets and enter the information or data from them as perception data?
I do not. Essentially what I do is at the end of the lesson, those exit tickets come back with me and I just flip through them really quickly. I use them to make sure, like, did the students get it? Did they understand what we are talking about? A lot of the times my exit ticket questions are asking the students to apply what we've talked about or reflect on themselves based off of what they've learned. And so the exit ticket both helps them to make a plan, to process and reflect, and then also gives me some information. The few times that I've done a lesson where the objective was knowledge acquisition, then I have entered that pre-post data into a spreadsheet and included that as part of my portfolio and referenced it.
Yeah, just a couple more. Let's see. So more organizational questions. So someone asked that they joined the webinar late and will they have access to the webinar from the beginning? Yes, so all attendees will be sent a copy of the webinar, and we hope to have it on our webinar, launched on our webinar. Sorry, we hope to have the webinar on our website shortly, where you'll be able to do a home study program with this information. And then someone also asked, where do we find your email address, Sarah? Ah, there we go.
There it is.
Okay. And as I mentioned, attendees will get a copy of this webinar. Just a couple more housekeeping things for those of you who participated today. We really want to thank you and hope this will be the beginning of a series of TSCA webinars. You will be receiving a session evaluation. Please complete that, and you'll also get a certificate of attendance. Sara, I can't thank you enough. This was absolutely amazing. As I say, I wish I was back in an elementary school now so I could implement some of these just phenomenal ideas.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to share with you all today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.